This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Ziak and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And Jay?
Yeah.
This is one of those episodes where we time travel back into the 90s and explore an entire decade with one band.
I love it. These are fun.
In just hopefully around an hour, because that's the time I like to keep these to, an hour or less. After that, people get tired of my voice, and I understand.
We'll try.
We're going to talk about a band from the UK, and people might have heard of them. They're called Depeche Mode. In fact, they literally just put out a new record.
Yeah,
and we're going to explore them.
Timing was great.
90s. Yes, well, with the advent of calendars, now we can see when things are going to happen.
Well, but we've done this series for a while now, and I can't think of many other times when we've been fortunate enough to talk about a band that's actually putting on new music.
It's true. Previously, we did like Aerosmith and New Order and
Tom Petty,
Neil Young. Yeah, hasn't happened. But this time it happened. So we brought two people who have been here before, and we know that they know about Depeche Mode. Because one time we tried to bring in people who didn't know anything about the band we were talking about, and it was a complete disaster. But this time, we are welcoming back to the show from the Great White North, Ian McIver. Welcome back, Ian.
Hello.
And from deep south, down south, well, where you are, Jay, in Austin, Texas, Matt Shiverdecker. Shiv, how you doing?
I'm great, Tim. Thanks for having me.
You guys are like at complete opposite ends of North America. That's well, not you're not exactly up in the snow and polar bear end of Canada, but
just snow.
Just snow. Is it still snowing there, or have we passed that point?
Where I am, it was snowing yesterday.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
That's a big no for me.
That's a big
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about Depeche Mode in the 90s. With this series, we like to talk about bands that, like, you know, were big and popular in the 80s, like we did with Tom Petty, like we did with New Order. But then how did they transition in the 90s? What did their sound change? Was there drama? Maybe there's some drama to talk about with this band. I don't know. We'll find out and figure out, like, did this band survive the 90s? Like when we talked about, say, Van Halen in the 90s, they kind of it was
didn't
rough.
Survive.
They did not survive the 90s.
Not real. I mean, yes, the band existed in some form, but it was never the same.
No. But with Depeche Mode, they've been a pretty consistent band in terms of putting out releases and also indulging in solo material from the various members of the group. We'll get into that. Let me ask, when was the first time you listened to Depeche Mode, Matt?
I mean, that's a great question, because I mean, really and truly, my coming of age into alternative music, you know, really sort of coincides with Violator in many ways. And I mean, of course, they had singles before that time that had been, you know, pretty mainstream and successful, that I was, you know, I'm sure I was slightly aware of in my very rural Ohio upbringing. But, you know, I started listening to Waxy around 1989, and then, you know, Violator really, you know, it's kind of like all of 1990 and even 9 to 91, I would guess. So that's a time when, I had first started listening to the station, and they played like every song off of the record practically. Like there were so many singles off of Violator.
Yep.
So I couldn't say specifically when I was aware of them before that, but that is certainly, that would have been the first album that I bought myself.
Okay.
Undoubtedly would have been Violator.
Got it. What about you,
as
Ian?
a teenager.
Was it around that time or earlier?
Yeah, so I recall earlier, like the video signals. So "People Are People" in 1984, that was a big single, obviously in North America. And that's when they started to build momentum in the States. But for me, it would be Violator, and it's the first one that I actually bought, actually on cassette with my own money. This is a CD that I later got signed by Alan Wilder. It was one that I chose because it was, okay, it's the first one. I recall hearing them. Up here, the MTV equivalent, Much Music, I'd be watching that quite regularly growing up. Every Friday, my family would watch the music video countdown of that. So, and as they're building in popularity throughout the 80s, they would be a bit more regularly featured. And then when 1990 came, followed 89 with Personal Jesus, and then beginning of 1990 with Enjoy the Silence, those videos were obviously in heavy rotation. So, I ended up weighing a gift certificate to one of the local music stores, and just at the end of March, and that was the big album that was out at the time. I was like, oh, hey, I like these guys, and then it went from there, and I'll continue on the story as we go throughout the 90s.
Sounds good. Jay, do you remember like when you first became aware of Depeche Mode?
Yeah, Depeche Mode and The Cure were, I think, in junior high. So this would have been probably 88, 89, were two of the first, I think, alternative bands, quote unquote, that I became aware of. There was just a group of kids I remember in school that were super into them. And now when I think back, I think at the time we probably would have said they're goth, but in hindsight, they kind of weren't. In the way that you would think of like Susie and the Banshee or something. But there was a group of kids in school that really loved them. And I heard it in passing. I heard them in passing probably in the late 80s, but it wasn't really until Violator where I kind of put together like, oh, that song is Depeche Mode, and started to obviously see them everywhere on MTV and on the radio a lot more. How about you?
Pretty much the same. I remember like People Are People and hearing that. I think that was even wasn't that connected to like the Olympics in 84? Some like in the UK. I want to say that that's somehow connected to that period.
A lot of countries did latch on at that time with the Olympics. It wasn't officially endorsed by the Olympics or anything like, say, World in Motion with New Order in 1999 for FIFA. But a lot of countries obviously latched on to that song.
And I think there must have been a station in Buffalo that was playing that song, because I have it on a mixtape that I made when I recorded songs off the radio on my boombox. So like in between the Fat Boys and Phil Collins, there's like People Are People. It was just another pop song to me. Like I didn't have any like idea of where they came from or what other stuff sounded like. I just knew that one song. But the first time I remember seeing them was probably the video. Is it the video for Enjoy the Silence where he's like has a crown on?
Yes, the king with the lawn chair.
Yes. That's the first time I remember seeing them and being like, oh, that's what that band looks like. Okay. And then actually hearing repeated singles. And then once that happened, then I was like completely aware when Songs of Faith and Devotion came out. I was like, I knew what was happening. And I remember when it came out and all that kind of stuff. So, and we'll get into those records as we talk about the band. We should talk about, first of all, I just want to mention, because, this is a band that existed from 1980 on. The original lineup was Dave Gahan, Martin Gore, Andy Fletcher, and Vince Clarke. What people might not know is that Vince Clarke left and then became very successful on his own in multiple bands. He was in Yazoo,
Yeah,
and then
in the
Erasure.
UK. Yeah, and the Assembly in between as well.
Yep. So it wasn't like he left and didn't do anything. Like he basically had a different vision. And I don't know. Do you know what the story is of why Vince Clarke left?
There's different things. I mean, he left right after Speak and Spell was released in the UK. Some of it was just how big they were getting. He was uncomfortable with that, and there's that aspect of it. I think he just also that's probably the main one that I've heard quite a bit. I mean, there's probably a couple others, and who knows? I mean, they've all spoken nicely about Vince's time with the band, so there's never been any mud slung or anything like that. So and any drama around it leaving wasn't as publicized as something we'll get into later. Yeah, I mean, he continued on because even afterwards, the Yazoo song "Only You," I believe it was, he did offer to the band as well, but they're like, no, we're fine, and so they went on their own independent things, but both still on Mute Records, both being mentored by Daniel Miller, and obviously went in different paths. But I mean, even in 2011, 2012, Vince Clarke and Martin Gore recorded a side project together. So there's obviously no bad blood there.
And then Alan Wilder was who replaced Clarke, correct?
Yeah, so he saw an ad in Melody Maker.
Wait, they put an ad in Melody Maker?
Yeah, they didn't say who the band was or anything.
Oh.
So when he read it, he kind of thought, okay, this is who it is, because putting two and two together, it's like, okay, I recall them having issues with one of their members leaving, then this ad. So my common sense is tingling type moment. And so he joined. They had a whole bunch of people, but they couldn't really play the keyboards. And then he comes in and he's classically trained. And it's like, okay, can you play this part? Now can you play both of these parts together? And of course, he's doing it on I mean, the joke usually is, I mean, he'd be playing the part with one hand and reading the newspaper with the other. So he joined, and he stayed on as a touring musician throughout 1982, and then eventually came to a point where it's like, okay, what are you doing with me? I mean, let me know if you're just going to retain me on this part-time basis, essentially. I mean, I'm going to find other stuff. I mean, but then January 31st, 1983, the first single with Alan Wilder was "Get the Balance Right," and then he was a full-time member since.
So he joined for Construction Time again. It was Vince Clarke was with album. Speak and Spell and Broken Frame. So
no, Broken Frame was just the three.
Oh, it was just the three. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm looking through the release history of, they were pretty consistent, like 81, 82, 83, 84, 86, 87. And you can see them slowly getting more popular around the world as each record goes. Like the first couple are, they do well in the UK, they do well in Sweden, Germany, Italy, that kind of thing. And then when they get to Some Great Reward, then it starts to then you get like a 51 in the US, and you're charting in Australia, and you're charting for Black Celebration, the next one. And then when you reach 87 with Music for the Masses, then you've got like top 10 charting and number 35 in the US. So they're definitely becoming like a global band, as opposed to a UK band that has some random US fans, like a lot of UK bands do.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to keep in mind, I mean, every album Depeche Mode has been a top 10 UK album, and that on at release. I mean, this isn't something that they charted later on. I mean, they've always had this following, and 87 and 88 is probably the best part point that we start to transition into the 90s. So, because in 88, we'll start off with the June 18th, 1988, the infamous Rose Bowl concert and that. So you could see their popularity is building up throughout the States throughout this time. And then they have this concert. They sell out the Rose Bowl, 60,000 people. And this is documented in the film 101 and the soundtrack. So actually I've got that right there.
Did those have singles on MTV?
So Music for the Masses, the initial Strangelove video didn't really get much airplay in the US, although in 88 they had a re-release, and it's referred to as fans as Strangelove 88 as the album version. So which was essentially a different mix of the Daniel Miller mix, 12-inch mix that he was commissioned for. He didn't produce Music for the Masses, but they found that he really streamlined that song. And so as they were building up this momentum throughout the States, and they have this tour going on, because I mean, the 3 singles for Music for the Masses were released in 87. You can make exception for Little 15 and May of 88, though that was just certain European countries. But they re-released the Strangelove single to help promote this, and then they have this concert, and then afterwards they have the live album and film. And of course, this is such a high point, and it's like, okay, where are we going to go to next? And so, which brings us to now 89. And when they started recording Violator, they're like, okay, this is going obviously planned for 1990. It's like, okay, we have to change what we're doing. We're going to have to step it up. I mean, I don't think they were expecting it to go as big as they did. I mean, they knew that they were getting popular, but I don't think, I mean, when they did the Rose Bowl concert, they think, okay, this is going to be a one-off stadium tour, not, okay, our next world tour is going to be stadiums. So, so they go in, they start recording Violator. They started off in Milan in Logic Studios, and the one single that came out of that in 89 was the Personal Jesus, so the limited and the regular CD single. So they launched that. UK date was August 29th. So those are the dates that I tend to work with, are the UK ones for obvious reasons. And it's still like over 6 months in advance of the album, but they started getting this response. And in the States, there's such demand for this band that this becomes like Warner Brothers' biggest 12-inch single that they sold. I mean, they had Madonna, they had Prince, and then here's this alternative band. I mean, 3 guys behind a keyboard that had sold out the Rose Bowl, and then now they're selling this million-seller single and that. So they, I mean, the demand kept growing. And then when it came time for 1990, and that, so, well, after Milan, they went back to Denmark to Puck Studios, finished off the album. And then, so in the beginning of 1990, February 5th, they released Enjoy the Silence. Everyone is familiar with that one. I mean, I would say it's their signature song, but I have so many songs going through my head that my perception of the general public is obviously quite skewed. Right. And that.
So you mentioned the singles. Looking back at this, and I was, re-listening to the album over the last week and the other albums from the 90s. I feel like at least 7 of these songs got played on the radio. Am I wrong, guys? Because
there's 4 singles. There's 4 singles. So the second one was Enjoy the Sound. So I've got the 3 UK ones, the limited, the extra limited, and then third one was Policy of Truth, which little trivia is the only single to chart higher in the US than the UK. So yeah,
that's a weird one.
So yeah, so they released Policy of Truth, and then the last one was World in My Eyes, which that's the promo one. So World in My Eyes. So that, which is the late Andy Fletcher's favorite Depeche Mode song.
Let me take you on a trip around the world and back, and you won't have to move, you just sit still. Now let your mind do the walking, let my body do the talking. Let me show you the world with my eyes. I'll take you to the highest mountain.
So those were the 4 official singles. I don't have it. There was a radio promo of Halo released.
I was going to say, I was going to try
So
to
that
catch you
was-
on that one.
Yeah. So that was North America only. And then as well, there was the Strange 2 video, which also included Clean as a 6th video. So both Halo and Clean had videos made for that compilation and would have gotten airplay as well. The Halo video is known for having an up-and-coming actress, Jenna Elfman, in it.
Oh,
Amazing.
So she's one of the dancers
Wow.
in that. So yeah, so I mean, for people to say there were a lot of singles, there was a lot of promotional material around this album
right.
and that, and obviously, I mean, the response. I mean, when it launched March 20th in the U.S., so the 19th in the U.K. But I'm sticking with the American because this ties into another thing. There was a signing in Los Angeles at the warehouse, and they thought, okay, this is going to be, we show up and there's going to be some people, we'll sign some stuff. 20,000 people showed up to this. They had to call in riot police.
Wow.
That's crazy.
So, like,
For some
the
dudes with
appetite-
synthesizers.
Yes,
It's not Guns N'
So-
Roses.
No, and this ties in. I mean, like with other stuff that's going on, because remember, this is 1990. So what else is going on? You've got the rise of the alternative nation going on at this time as well,
Right.
and it doesn't fully coalesce into what the Americans would want their alternative sound to be until 1991. But I mean, this is another sign that, hey, okay, we're not just sticking with the traditional pop and rock of our parents.
Right. It felt like, and Jay and Shiv, you can back me up on this. It felt like in 90, before we had the alternative explosion, but we did have alternative music because like REM, people knew REM, they were on MTV.
Yeah.
It
Jane's
felt like
Addiction.
there was like no, like anything could get popular
Yeah.
for like a year or two in the alternative space. Like you knew that the big heavy, hair metal bands were going to be popular, but like there's Faith No More in 89, and like Living Color was completely different than those hair metal bands, but they rocked. And then, you mentioned Jane's Addiction, and it just,
I mean, I think that, the success of Violator specifically there, you really start to see that the power of what alternative radio was becoming at that point, that pre-Nevermind moment where radio in the United States was so much more adventurous. And, I still have quite a few of the old station copies of things that, like Personal Jesus became such a massive hit that then Warner rushed out white label 12 inches of an acoustic version of Personal Jesus for alternative radio to have like an exclusive, because it was all over pop at a certain point. So like I still have the in studio 12 inch that they would play on the air of the acoustic Personal Jesus. I mean, I went
Yeah, the
back to
acoustic
look.
version.
Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say the acoustic version wasn't Rush by Warren. That was always on the original Mute CD and 12-inch.
Oh. Well, they definitely like
But they
wanted to promote it. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I
Um,
remember that time when there would be like the radio exclusive version where you would hear like they would make a big deal about like this is, you know, there'd be some song and there'd be like an acoustic version of it that was, and that doesn't like happen anymore. There's no outlet for that anymore.
No, now they're speeding songs up.
Oh.
I
Or slowing them
which is
down.
which is a whole nother thing.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I went to look out of curiosity. I pulled up the 97X best of 1990 countdown, and unsurprisingly, Violator was the #1 album of the year.
Yeah, and Violator. I remember in the 2000s, my best friend one time he sent me a list of various music lists that a site had did, and it was different genres and that we were quite interested. And when it came to the electronic albums, Violator was #1. And that, I mean, they're listing all these other bands that you would think, okay, like younger crowd is going to gravitate to these bands more. But I mean, they were like, no, I mean, without this album, without this band, the other 9 on our list wouldn't be here. And I mean, even in 1991 was being released, the Pet Shop Boys, they were recording Behavior, and Neil Tennant was like, we heard it and we were instantly jealous of it. It's like they raised the bar, and that they're like, okay, we were here, now we're up here, come and get us.
Well, it felt like this is the correct me if I'm wrong, but it felt like this was the first one that felt more organic with like the use of guitars, and they would use and go more even that way with the next out record.
They had guitars on like Construction Time again, but they were sampled and that.
Right.
But by the time you get to Violator, Alan Wilder and Flood, they were looking at what was being done in rapid hip hop in terms of looping. So now they're taking sections of drum parts instead of programming each individual drum beat and that. So now they're starting to say, okay, we're doing the live performance, and this will come in later into our conversation for the next album. But you're right in that it's more organic. I mean, like this album, when you look at electronic music, I mean, electronic music is very rigid. This album has a groove and a sexiness to it that you don't really get in the genre. Beforehand or even after. And that you can see, like, this stands out because it's like, you know what, it sounds different. Like, it's not like, okay, we're just trying to get the 4 on the floor, we're not trying to get people just up and dancing. Like, this has that groove that it's like, you know what, you feel it.
Revisiting it, I was surprised on how much it kind of gets out of the way of David Cann's vocals too. Like, it's not over, it's simple, there's a lot of space in it, you know, a song like Waiting for the Night or even like Sweetest Perfection. Like, yes, there's a lot of electronics and stuff going on, but like it's also like getting out of the way so that you can hear him sing. And I think that helps it kind of transcend beyond just electronic music. It's like, no, this is like full on, really well written pop music.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that I mean, they had, you know, there had always been great mixes for them, but like I feel like coming into these singles, I mean, there are some remixes of tracks, you know, from Violator on where I'm just like, they're some of my favorite, you know, versions of, you know, I almost like prefer mixes to the album versions. They just always had great they picked the right people.
Yeah, you have to thank Francois Kevorkian for this. So I mean, like he worked with Kraftwerk beforehand, and that was one of the things. So and plus also the production with Flood. I mean, like him working in tandem with Alan Wilder. I mean, that was a very good example of synergy where it's like, okay, you have two great people, but just together they're producing something better. And I mean, like this album. I mean, I know we have our rankings and worthy album. I mean, I'd go one step further and say this is a perfect album. That in itself is a roundtable discussion on its own. But this would be the first. I mean, this would be the first album right out of my mouth for
Right.
that perfect album.
It's like one of those records where you don't skip a track.
Yeah, there's no filler
Agreed.
on this. Revisiting it, I was like, there's no filler songs on here. These are all very strong.
And the B-sides are great as well.
Yeah.
A lost
And we
art.
should also mention that like a lot of B-sides from this band, a lot of compilations because of that, a lot of remix compilations and all that kind of like this is almost as much as like New Order in terms of the amount of releases. They're not just records, but like extra material and remixes and all that.
Back in the day when you could actually walk into like a Best Buy and there would be CDs. I just remember being blown away when Warner did the reissue. They did all the singles boxes, and like that there was an incredible amount of physical product, kind of always when it came to Depeche Mode. And it just always sold.
And-
Like absolutely rabid fan base that purchased everything.
That's Ian. That's Ian.
Yeah. Yeah. UK, Canadian. I have a lot. So my wife
I have a
I
question.
need to replace the word devoted with obsessed.
Do you have, you mentioned the riot that happened at the signing,
The warehouse cassettes.
the
No.
warehouse, do you have that? No?
No, I did try to track it down online like years ago, but then when my stereo with my only cassette player died on me about 15, 16 years ago, kind of been like, I mean, I wouldn't mind, but I mean, one side is an interview that they had, so I'm pretty sure you could find it online. Then the other side was something to do the metal mix from Shake the Shake the Disease single, and that which I have. So I mean, the interview is one thing, but there was no exclusive tracks or
Got
anything.
it. I didn't know if that was like
kind
your holy grail of you're searching for it endlessly.
No. From this era, though, one of the holy grails would be the radio promo for Personal Jesus, the 7-inch. On the back had the nude model with each individual members of the band, and depending on which one you had. So the 7-inch was Martin Gore, but the radio promo, it's a straight black sleeve. So, and that one is hard to find. But yeah, so that would be up there. But other rarities though for Violator that I can show you. So I do have the Japanese pressing for Violator and the associated singles. All
And the
complete with
Japanese pressing has like a whole bunch of other
the
tracks, right?
strips. No, it's all the same tracks. So, but they're complete. So I started out with World in My Eyes and Policy of Truth because it had all the tracks on CD, whereas US or North American one didn't have all the tracks. Same thing the UK did, but especially for World in My Eyes. So I got those, and then eventually I got the Violator and Personal Jesus, because I'm like, well, I might as well. The Violator one is a double disc, which has Enjoy the Silence. So I've got the first edition with the pressing there on it. So it duplicates one of the remixes with its edit instead of having the hands and feet mix.
So obviously with the success of this record, they toured, they played stadiums in the US. Tons of
funny enough, this tour, it wasn't as big as the last one. I mean, obviously Music for the Masses, they went to 101 dates, with obviously the Rose Bowl being the 101st, hence the title. But they only did 88 dates on this tour. And that. So
well,
They played to more people, obviously, but
Did they want to get back in the studio? Because they were back in the studio, I think, in '92.
not really. So they took some time off. So in '91, Alan Wilder and Martin Gore, they recorded the song Death's Door for the Until the End of the World soundtrack.
Take my rest among the blessed. Mother, are you waiting? Father, are you pacing? I'm coming home. I'm knocking on death's door. Will I take my rest in my Sunday best? Mother, are you anxious? Father, are you
And that, there was also the jazz mix, which was on a flexi disc for with the fan club, with one of the Bong magazines. And then Alan Wilder obviously stayed busy. He recorded with Nights Are Ebb for Ed Head, which you have previously discussed on this
We've discussed
episode.
that record.
And little secret for you and Jay, that is the episode how I discovered you guys.
Oh, nice.
And but even before that, one of the things when I was yelling at my podcast, so prior to Ed Head, they released an EP called As Is, where they had different mixers. So Alan Wilder did the mix of Come Undone. I guess kind of a trial thing, but Nights Are Ebb opened for them on the World Violation tour, and even beforehand, so they've been friends. But Family Man was originally originally mixed by Jazz Coleman of Killing Joke. So yeah, so when Ed Head came out, they had remixed it and included it. So that's why there's that sticker saying, "Oh, Family Man is included and it's remixed and all that." So that's how that came about.
Gotcha.
And then Alan Wilder also recorded his third release, Bloodline, for Mute Records. So this was the first full album. The other two were EPs. This is also the first one with lyrics and had the Faith Healer single with Douglas McCarthy of Nights Are Ebb doing the vocals. So he stayed.
I did not realize those bands were so tight. Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a long history between the two, and you can hear it in the music. I mean, as Nights Are Ebb progressed, I mean, you can hear a lot of the Depeche Mode rubbing off of them, and then even some of the stuff that they were doing. I mean, especially with Alan Wilder doing the Ebb Head, that would come into play with the next album. But yeah, so they stayed busy, but they took the year off, and then. The other big change that would happen that would lead up was Dave Gahan moving to Los Angeles in the
Which was not a good idea.
Which was not a good idea. So
because of the drugs.
Yeah, so I'll come back on to those repercussions. But yeah, so Dave had obviously gone down his own abyss there, which we continue on and we'll come back to. But so they all took the year off, and then they meet in 1992 to record the follow-up to Violator. They're again working with Flood, and Flood in the interim had produced a little album called Octone Baby for some band called U2.
Heard of it?
I'm sure people have heard of that. So, but with that album, the U2 had lived together and worked together in Germany. And so then he had this idea for the Depeche Mode to do this. So they went around. I mean, they had been touring or recording around Europe. So eventually they settled on Madrid in Spain, and they rented out this villa and they converted it into a studio, which was not the best thing. So the other thing that had changed, they kind of had it a bit with Violator, but they wanted Martin's demos to be very stripped down. So it worked on Violator, but with this album, they didn't do any pre-production. They went straight into recording, which was a huge mistake because they're not like every band. I mean, like Alan and Martin would try jamming on like a bass and a guitar, but they weren't getting anywhere. It's like, this is not how they function. So after these 6 weeks, I mean, they had not much usable. Alan toasted Flood is like, here's to a complete fucking waste of time. and I mean, obviously you've got Dave going through his own issues and demons right now. Fletch as well, he's wrestling his own demons because he's going through a depression that will come to a head later on in our conversation. And that, so I mean, the band is not functioning, whereas Violator, they were a unit, they were a gang. It's like, okay, and even if there was stuff that had to be changed, they knew it was for greater good. Enjoy the Silence being the prime example. It was originally a ballad. Martin was just on a harmonium and organ, and then it's like, okay, no, there's potential. Let's Alan Flood, we're going to work on this. You guys take off, come back, and it's like, okay, we've sped up. Here it is. Let's add this guitar part. Let's do this. So they recognize, okay, we've got something special. That was not the case with the recording for Devotion. And so all these little things now are starting to, all these cracks and everything are really starting to show in the machine.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about that record, and in comparison to what just came out, how I remember when this came out, like all of a sudden they were on MTV. Dave Gahan was like a celebrity.
Yeah.
Like I remember seeing him on my TV as much in like 93 as like Kurt Cobain. And when this record, and when this record came out, what did you guys think of revisiting this record? Jay, I know that you're, I'm not going to say what I said earlier. You are a newer Depeche Mode fan. Is that what?
I didn't get the band, I think, at the time. Like, I knew the songs, I was well aware of them. I didn't hate them or love them. I was just like, okay, it's a band I don't really necessarily get. Revisiting it now and being so familiar with a lot of the catalog just because it's so popular, and it's endured. I'm able now to, I think, get past the sort of electronic production and understand the songs better and appreciate Dave Gahan as a singer. So stuff on this record that I'm going to react to best are, again, where the songs are the strongest. So I think the front half of the record feels stronger to me. You can hear a little bit more like performance feel. Maybe that's coming, like you're hearing drums that are more organic and dynamic. You're hearing like maybe some bass that's not synth, it's actual guitar bass in some of the songs. So there's a little bit of I think, production switch here. It also feels a little more 90s to me, whereas Violator feels more timeless. I start to hear like some sounds and things that are more typical that I would think of from that maybe Octoon Baby kind of sound. And I think there's a handful of really strong songs that really held up well. I like One Caress a lot. I love the idea of like strings and cello and just his vocal and things staying simpler.
When you think you've tried every road, every avenue, take one more look, what you found old, and in it you'll find something new. Oh, girl, lead me into your darkness when this world is trying its hardest to leave me unimpressed. Just one caress from you and I'm blessed. I'm shying from the light.
And then they bring back the sort of the formula a little bit from Personal Jesus with that bluesy guitar lick over top of, sort of an electronic pop song for I Feel You that works really well too. So those were some of my impressions of the record.
It's so interesting to me that like I Feel You was the first single, because it's kind of an abrasive track, and
Yeah.
and then in that one, oh my God, I mean, there are some incredible remixes of that song, but like for that to come out of the gate as the lead single, I think was a really interesting choice. But then, it's kind of allowed Walking in My Shoes to be such a layup, because I mean that's a quintessential Depeche Mode song to me. That is, I mean, I think is one of their greatest singles.
Yeah, Alan Wilder had always intended and wanted Walk in My Shoes to be the second single. When it came time for release, Dave Gahan, he wanted Condemnation to be the lead single. I mean, that's one of his favorite songs, and that.
Mine too.
I love that song, and I have since the record came out, but it's not like a radio single. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And yet it was.
And yet it was. Well, now you know what? Now it makes me think of "Tender" by Blur, and oh yeah, that was kind of a huge song. Maybe there's something to that.
Radio was different.
Yeah, radio was different. That's true.
Yeah. So obviously, I've got the two singles here. I also have a promotional postcard for I Feel You from the UK. So, but yeah, so that was the first one. So, I mean, after Madrid, they went to Hamburg, to Chateau de Pape, or Pape. I'm not sure how it's pronounced in European. So, so there they established more of their regular routine. I mean, and despite like you've got a lot of these live instruments, I mean, this is still a very electronic album. I mean, everything is sampled and loops. The drums, yeah, they're live drums, but they're just segments of live drums that have been then sampled, tweaked, quantized, everything. So same thing with the bass on like Walk in My Shoes. I mean, the only track you can actually properly say is fully live is this one Caress, which also going back to I Feel You was the B-side and that. So, but yeah, so this is still very much an electronic album, and that, and obviously a couple things that I have here. So one of the ones that I have to show you. So a nice little media promotional thing. Promo photo. It has a biography. It has an invite to a pre-release party. So if I go back in time, I'm going to make sure to bring this. That's item number one on my DeLorean. And that, but and then obviously I also have from the U.S. Promotional sleeves. They're 12-inch, but they all have promotional of each of the band members going through. So yeah. So I mean for me, I mean this. I've said it on my previous appearance. This is my all-time favorite album, and I mean this is strong. I mean when this came out for me, I mean 91, 92, I'm still going through a lot of musical discovery. I mean, by the time fall of 92 comes around, I turn 15. So it's like, okay, I'm still trying to discover all these things and that. But then this album comes out and it's just like, oh my goodness. I mean, like I love the previous one. Okay, I like what I'm hearing. So this is the one that, okay, unlock something inside me, and it's just like, okay. And now this is where it's like, okay, I'm not just listening to music. I want to go into the back catalog, and I want to listen to music for the masses and Black Celebration, work my way back.
Right.
So like I said, Violator was the one that started my music, and this is the one that just took it to the next level where it's like, okay, you know what? I'm not just going to listen to what my friends are listening to. I'm going to start my own internal music discovery and say, okay, I want to go back. And because of this, what else is similar? What else is like this? And
right.
Because obviously 91, 92, 90. And this, I mean, I feel he came out on February 15th of 93. And then the Songs of Faith and Devotion had his 30th birthday last week on the March 22nd. And so, yeah, so we know what music was like in the US and Canada
right.
at the time.
Well, it's interesting because, yeah, this is a band that's now going on 13 years, and they're competing theoretically with bands that are on their first or second record in terms of being MTV rotation, in terms of, you know, alternative radio station rotations and spins, and they're just in a completely different musical space than all those bands, and they're like holding their own. That's pretty nuts. But again, that's 93. So
and
then
obviously held their own because they went to #1 in both the UK and the US and various other countries.
So
yeah,
they
they managed much longer than many of their contemporaries to stay a band that alternative radio would support.
And they did a huge tour. It was debaucherous from what I've read.
Yes.
to the point where when it was over, Dave Gahan died.
Yeah, so I'll step back a bit. Just so in 1993, because there's a few things that came up. So obviously, yes, in May of 1993, they start the devotional tour. So this tour was 14 months, 159 days. I mean, there was stuff in between. I mean, beforehand, on April 26th, they had Walk in My Shoes, which we've discussed. But so they start this tour, and again, everyone's not in the best of conditions. So throughout the tour and that, so there were times where band members got arrested. So Martin, like in Dallas, I believe it was, he got arrested because he was heavily intoxicated. They thought he was playing the music too loud. No, he was singing too loud. And that. So there was cases like that. Dave Gahan and the touring manager Daryl Beaumont, they got arrested in Quebec City, if I'm recalling correctly. So there in Montreal. So that there were incidences, and then in October of 1993, after the main set, Dave Gahan starts to have heart palpitations, and it's suspected that may have been a bit of related to an overdose, and that like he could not go back on to do the encore. So Alan Wilder and Martin Gore went back on and did the acoustic version of Death's Door, because that night they did the rotated song One Caress, and coincidentally that song, that recording, made it to Songs of Faith and Devotion live. So when Dave had this medical issue, the song is from that show is actually on the official release.
Oh, okay.
But
I just want to point out that what you're describing is like Rolling Stones circa 1970 with like Keith Richards getting arrested, or like just the debauchery of them recording Exile on Main Street. And you're talking about guys that were like 12 years before looked like nerds on computers, and now they're the Rolling Stones at their most debaucherous.
These stories sound very Motley Crue-esque.
Yeah, that's what's so crazy. It's like they're behaving the exact same way that the hair bands were behaving at the end of the 80s.
Yeah. So in 1993, the other thing that in September 13th they released Condemnation and a live the live limited, which had some of the tracks, but coming back to one of my prized collections. So I have here 2 CDRs. This was never released, so this is the full devotional soundtrack. It's also dated September 13th, and that. So that I got Alan Wilder sold off a bunch of memorabilia, and this was one that I was like, wow, I want that. So wow. I don't have the CFA and that, but it is the full unedited soundtrack. So in answer to your question, yes, I have stuff that was not released by the band.
Wow.
And but a lot of the tracks were used on Songs of Faith and Devotion Live, which was just a track by track. So they didn't release a full live album of the tour. Going back to World Violation, nothing live was ever released, and they thought, okay, Rose Bowl is such a big thing, they didn't want to repeat themselves, and also some of it is hindsight is 2020. there is some studio or footage for like MTV and the sorts. So the Dodgers show in 1990 was recorded, and clips have been released online thanks to Brat on the official website. But yeah, so but this one was a bit more documented, and then in January 10th of 94, they released the In Your Room single, which also had it. This is the fold out pack, which forms.
Did we have that at the radio station? Because
this is the UK version.
Oh, okay. I feel like we
So
had
it folds up.
a single with that at the radio station.
Yeah, there
Maybe.
is a US version which doesn't have all the tracks and everything.
Got it.
So
that just cover like it was like seeing a very 90s cover.
Yeah. So yeah. So and the In Your Room single, the 7-inch version was the Zephyr mix remixed by grunge darling Butch Vig, and it pales. In Your Room, the album version, is probably my all-time favorite track of theirs, and really epitomizes that band. It just builds throughout the entire 6 minutes, and the lyrics, if you're looking for a song that represents the band, this is one of them, and it was unfortunately turned into a generic song. I say it sounds like garbage because he worked with Duke Erickson and Steve Marker, who also formed Garbage Violator. So
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah. So, but continuing on with the Troubles. So in February of 1994, they start the Exotic Leg in Johannesburg, and Alan Wilder suffers from kidney stones, and that. And so yeah, so they postponed a couple dates there. While they were down there, he had surgery, and that because it was either that or try to pass a hedgehog through a golf hole, which isn't happening. And and then towards the end of the Exotic Legs, they continue on to Australia and Southeast Asia. Going back, so Andy Fletcher is dealing with depression. He can no longer continue, and that. So at the end of March in Hawaii, that's the last time all 4 members were on the stage at the same time. And so he leaves, goes back home. They still have the final US leg, a second leg going through, and they promote their tour manager, who started out hauling equipment for them in 1980, Daryl Beaumont, to take over on keys. And so, I mean, this is always one of the great debates of what does Andy Fletcher do? And that, I mean, he is not the musician that Alan or Martin are, but he's a better keyboard player than probably a lot of people give credit for, because he does have parts. Yes, Alan is dealing with all the main melodies. Yes, Martin has the secondary and counter melodies, but there's still a lot of the samples and triggers and other stuff that goes on. A lot of those sounds are going through his keyboards and that. So, Alan sat down with Daryl, and they did this in Hawaii over a weekend, eventually learned the parts. And then at the beginning of April, they start in South America, and that's when Daryl starts on stage and continues on throughout the US tour. So like I said, all the members were casualties, and that had some issue with this. So and then at the end, obviously in Cincinnati, Dave Gahan misjudges his jump off of the stage and lands on some of the fixed seats in the front and cracks his ribs. And already he's dealing with a drug problem, and now he's on painkillers as well. So at the end of the tour, everyone is spent, and that. So they take some time away, and then when they meet, it's just Alan, Martin, and Fletch. And Alan had decided, I'm going to wait some time, put my distance from myself from the tour, because obviously at the end of the tour, especially one like this, it's like you don't want to make any rash decisions. And he meets with them and then ultimately decides that he is going to leave the band. And I mean, there's lots of debates. He released an official statement on June 1st, 1995, which was also his 36th birthday. And I mean, it was a combination of a lot of stuff. And I mean, obviously he had issues with Fletch. There was communication between him and Martin were at an all-time low throughout the Songs of Faith and Devotion. I mean, there are video clips online of them doing the tour setup and pre-programming all that for the tour, for the World Violation Tour. For Devotional, Alan did everything himself. So, I mean, like, this is not a team. And obviously, and as well, Dave's in his own world. I mean, Dave found out through facts, and Dave's admit, I mean, like, yeah, it might have been a bit self-centered of him, but he had his own problems going on as well. Like, whatever. I mean, like starting of 95, I mean, Dave did go in and out of rehab, but ultimately that did not stick. So, but like I said, unfortunately, Alan leaves. It was the best time. I mean, people say, what would have happened if he stayed on? He wouldn't have lasted past the Ultra recording session. Everything that was bothering him throughout the Songs of Faith and Devotion sessions would have been amplified, because just before we get into those, I mean, obviously the first big issue that happened with Dave was his attempted suicide attempt in August of 95. And that, so that was his first dance with death, and that. So this is before the recording, but it shows what state of mind he was in. The other things, just a little sidebar, Martin Gore did stay productive in this time. He did record a cover of Leonard Cohen's Coming Back to You on the Tower of Song tribute album. And he also did a remix of Garbage Queer, the Most Beautiful Girl in Town mix. So he stayed somewhat busy, but obviously when they start going back to record Ultra, the first sessions in New York, Dave's just a mess. They can't even get a single vocal take out of him. They have one vocal that made it to Ultra for Sister of Night, and that's multiple vocal tracks taken together. So obviously the recording sessions weren't going well. So like I said, even if Alan stuck around, everything from Devotion would have been amplified. He would have been like, no, this is it. So I mean, there's no whataboutism about it, about his leaving.
So let's talk about Ultra, because I know what you said in terms of what are your, favorite records. I kind of consider this one to be my favorite Depeche Mode album. I guess the one I go back to the most often.
Yeah.
There's just, I think Martin Gore has two like really good songs on this record. Home is just like, that's a really good track. I don't usually think of Gore as singing the like singles, but has he sang any lead on any singles?
Yes. So in '84 there was a double A side with Blasphemous Rumors and Somebody. So Martin Gore obviously doing Somebody, and then in 1986 on Black Celebration, A Question of Lust was the second single. Again, that was a Martin Gore song, and then Home would be the third one.
Okay.
So.
And that has one of my favorite mixes. The Air remix of Home is is just amazing.
And Jay, what was your thoughts on this record in comparison to the first two?
Well, I mean, starting with the cover, I mean, it's the most 90s stereotypical looking of the three that we reviewed. I think sonically too, it starts off, you know, pretty angsty with Barrel of a Gun, which felt different to me lyrically and like even vocally. It sort of went from this like kind of moody, dark, romantic feel to suddenly like now we're angsty and a little bit more angry. I think Home is a great song. It's No Good is excellent.
Oh.
You get some more guitars here too.
Mhm.
There's even a guitar solo on Useless. And I think more live instrument sounds. The second half to me feels like unfinished. There's a lot of like, there's a couple interludes and just some weaker material, I think. So to me, of the three, it feels like, I don't know, probably the weakest of the three records in terms of just overall.
Tim, I'm fascinated that this is like a go-to for you, because I love the singles off of this record, but like this is one that I actually never like bought the vinyl of. Like it's not. I
I have it on vinyl.
I mean, I have a bunch of 12 inches from it, but I don't have I mean, I'm sure I've got the CD in a box somewhere, you know, but like it's not one that I like cherish.
It's because this came out.
Album.
This came out when I was definitely like addicted to music. Like I wasn't that way when the first two albums of the decade came out, but by this point, you know, I'm in my, what is this, 97? I'm in my fifth year of college, and
yeah, you are. Yeah, you are.
Gonna do my sixth in a year. And but I liked how this album, like you said, Jay, there's it sounds of the time in terms of like, you compare Barrel of a Gun to Ava Adore off of Adore. Those are very similar songs.
Let's not.
Wait, well, actually, right there, there's a band that essentially made a tribute album to Depeche Mode with Adore.
Okay, I'll give you that.
Yeah. So
and have previously done a nice cover of Never Let You Down Again.
Yeah, it was a B-side to one of their singles. So yeah, so not this album for me. So I mean, just backing up, I mean, the one thing that we skipped over, I mean, like I said, I talked about the poor recording sessions, but then at the end of May in '96, this is when Dave has his second dance with death and has the drug overdose. And then he was clinically dead and they had to revive him. And then after that, he's arrested for drug possession and threatened to be exported from the US. And of course, this is the one that makes him enter rehab, makes him stick. And I mean, I remember hearing about the drug overdose. I'm like, oh my goodness. And that, I mean, even the suicide, it's just like, oh my goodness. And it's like, okay, what's going to happen? And then when this album comes out, so more accurately, the singles. So Barrel of a Gun came out February 3rd of '97. So I've got here, and I'm in first year university now studying engineering, and a lot of time I was usually in the residence lounge because I had much music on. I mean, like I'm now, okay, there's all these different people around, people are listening to different stuff, and now I'm like, okay, I'm absorbing all this music in, and I have much music on me while I'm doing my assignments and that, because I like that. I mean, like, okay, yeah, I also stereotypical engineer. Yeah, I watch Star Trek once a week and that. So, but I'm here doing a calculus assignment, and then all of a sudden I hear a Barrel of a Gun. I'm like, oh my God, this sounds like the best one. I look up and I see them. I'm like, oh my, like, I was just as shocked because, I mean, like 8 months earlier, I mean, it's like, or not even like 7 months. It's just like, okay, he's had this overdose. Now they finished this album, because I mean, when he had the overdose, like I said, there was all this questions about what's going to happen with the album. I mean, they had poor sessions. There was not much material and that. And then, I mean, that weekend after my calculus midterm, I ran up to the mall and picked up the the single, and this is the one that started me on the hunt for UK stuff, because there was a different track listing and different remixes, and it's just like, oh, okay. And I really wasn't exposed to much for CD imports and all that in my hometown, and so it just took me by complete surprise. And then on March 31st, you have It's No Good released, and it's just like you see the video again. And both of these videos, I mean, they're strong videos, and both of the singles, Peril the Gun is tied for their highest charting single in the UK at number 4 with People Are People, and then in 2005 with Precious, and then It's No Good goes to number 5 in the UK. I mean, like, these are 2 of their highest charting singles. And that beating the ones. Enjoy the Silence only went to number 6. I Feel You and In Your Room only went to number 8. I mean, these are 2 songs that charted higher, and that, I mean, it shows what the demand was. And then and then the album's released on April 14th, and this one they didn't tour for. None of them were strong enough. I mean, they're still recovering from the last tour, still almost 3 years later, and so, I mean, unfortunately, it did cost them, because, I mean, there was obviously a lot of promotion in that. They released Home on June 16th as a single, and then I'll come back to the last one, but in a minute. But that one kind of got bypassed in the US, and then at the end of October, we have on the 13th, Alan Wilder comes back and he released Drifting, the first single for Unsung Methods. And then on the 20th is Useless in October. And then on the 27th was Alan Wilder's follow-up to Bloodline, Recoil Unsung Methods. And this is a spoiler alert and a note for Tim and Jay. This will be my pick for this year. Okay. This one deserves a deep dive and that. So I'm not going to say too much afterwards.
You mentioned that they didn't tour for this record. Did they? Do they do a tour for the rest of the decade?
No. Yeah. So they did. So they did do 2 launch parties for Ultra. They did one on April 10th in London, where they played the 4 singles from Ultra and Never Let Me Down Again. So this is also the first time that utilizing Christian Eigner on drums, who has been a touring musician with them since. The keyboards were a couple other people and that. But yeah, so and then in May 16th, they did another release party in Los Angeles. And that, so they only did the 2 shows for that, but there was no tour. And then, which kind of leads us into 98. So first thing was the follow-up. Alan Wilder released on March 9th, the single for Stalker, with Douglas McCarthy doing vocals again. But then they decide, okay, now's the time. They had discussed about with Ultra and that, especially like starting out, okay, let's do an EP or a couple of singles, and let's do a follow-up to the singles 81 to 85. And they released on September 7th, Only When I Lose Myself, and then on September 28th, the day after my birthday, the singles 86 to 98, which collected it. And at this time, they decide, now we're going to do another tour. And this was a small tour. This one here was only 66 dates over a 4-month period, and that's so quite small in comparison to what they had previously done.
And then they don't tour again until 2001 for
2001
when Exciter comes out.
Yeah. So this tour I missed. I started my 3rd year engineering in 98, and so I'm going through my courses. And so my power systems analysis and design course, Dr. Castle, he kept putting up dates for a potential midterm, and it's like, oh, we've got another midterm at this time or whatever. And then so the day before the tickets are going on sale for the North American date. So on Friday, September 19th, going to my class, he's like, I finally found a date. And I'm like, oh no, I just had that, sense that disturbance in the force. He pulls it back, November 5th, 7 p.m., the night that Depeche Mode is going to be in Toronto. And that, because I had everything planned out. It's like, okay, I know where I can get the ticket. On Fridays, the concert was on a Thursday. On Fridays, I only had one class at 8 o'clock in the morning. I didn't have anything else until like noon. So it's like, okay, I can sleep in and get notes from Rod or one of my other friends. And then he shows the date. I'm just like, no. And he's like, is there a problem with this date? I'm like, I just kept my mouth shut because I'm like, yeah, there is. I can't use it as an excuse to postpone a midterm. And that, so I was quite disappointed. In hindsight, and if I had probably more money and was a bit more had a bit more bravado than I do now, I probably would have gone to Montreal on November 6th. But that would have been a lot more money and a lot more travel because at the time I was in university in London, Ontario, which was only like an hour and a half bus ride away from downtown Toronto. So
Gotcha.
yeah.
And I will say that, Tim, of course, that was the fall after I graduated from Bowling Green.
Mhm.
I was only working part-time at 97X at that point, but because I had been music director at our college radio station WFAL, and I had close friends at Warner, that was the one time that I actually got invited to go to the meet and greet and actually get to go backstage and see them. And I'm still pissed because I do have a signed copy then of the singles collection, but they would not let us take photos, and they did one group photograph from that night of everyone who was there. That never ever made it to me. So somewhere someone at Warner Brothers has a photograph of a bunch of us in Detroit, Michigan at the Palace of Auburn Hills, standing awkwardly with the band.
Yeah.
Ian,
I never saw
you
it.
don't own that?
Never saw it.
No, and the one thing that the singles tour, I mean, like I said, I already mentioned that Christian Agner was with them for the Ultra parties. This is when they bring on Peter Gordino for the touring musician for keyboards. But no, since we're at the end of the decade, I will mention the only other thing that happened of note. So in 1999, Martin Gore was awarded the Ivor Novello Award for International Achievement in the United Kingdom, and that closes off the decade. But no, the only last rare thing I have here that I saved for the end are signed drumsticks from Alan Wilder for the Devotional Tour.
Nice.
So another crown in my collection. So. And one my wife constantly busts my balls over.
And I'm not walking into the other room to take it off the wall, but I do have from our old the radio station lobby, I have a lithograph of the songs of faith and devotion art that's signed. Yep. And it's in a very nice purple frame.
I wondered what happened to all that stuff out there.
Yeah, I mean that was one of the perks when the FM station went under. We got to go in order of seniority and pick the things we wanted off the wall. I mean, as you'll see behind me, there is a Kid A platinum plaque and a Fiona Apple title plaque. Those are from the old 97X lobby.
Wow. Nice.
Among with many other random things in my house.
So you mentioned we're at the end of the decade here, and usually we would ask at the end of these episodes, did this band survive the 90s or did the 90s do them in?
I'll go last.
Well, in this case, it's not like we're Van Halen where they disappeared for 12 years and then nothing, and then we put out a record and then there was not much, and then you know what I mean? Like,
well,
this band survived the 90s. Barely. I mean, barely survived.
Clearly, physically, barely.
Yeah.
But yeah, but everything, like, unlike other bands, and that, I mean, yes, they survived, but I mean, anything that would have done them in was internal. It was nothing to do with changing in musical taste or the public or anything. Everything was internal, whether it was through substance abuse, whether it was drugs or alcohol, or a band member leaving and that. But again, that was due to internal friction and strife. So like they clearly survived. And even then, I mean, like, unlike a lot of their contemporaries, I mean, to this date, they are still releasing top 10 albums. All their albums have gone top 10. They are still selling out arenas and stadiums in North America and Europe. I mean, this is not a band that was done in by the 90s by any sense. I mean, and if anything, I mean, there's always this debate, 80s band versus 90s band. I mean, like, they kept building in the 80s. They peaked in the 90s. Number 2, number 1 for the 3 albums, and not to mention number 5 for the singles collection in the UK, and 7, 1, and 5 for the 3 albums. I mean, all of them were top 10. So I mean, like, this is not a band that was the 90s. They defined the 90s themselves, or defined their 90s, I'll say, and that they didn't define the 90s. I mean, everyone has their own opinions, and a lot of times it comes back to a little band from Seattle, but they didn't say, oh, we're going to cave in. This is what we're going to do.
Yeah. And I think in the 90s, then by the end of it, you could hear Depeche Mode having such a big influence over that decade. Not just that they were big in it that themselves, but they had already influenced enough people where, like, Nine Inch Nails becomes a huge band in the 90s. Obviously, Trent Reznor is a Depeche Mode fan, but Depeche Mode being first in terms of bringing electronic music to such a large global audience, paves the way for Nine Inch Nails in its, you know.
Not just that. I mean, everyone looks at the electronics. I mean, but they were one of the pioneering bands for sampling and samplers. And that, I mean, they went on. I mean, yes, there's other industrial bands like Throbbing Gristle, but I mean, they influenced the industrial genre. They had a heavy hand in goth. Techno, house music from Detroit. I mean, they were in all these different genres, and that. I mean, it's a shame. I mean, we didn't really touch on 98. Yes, there was the Florida Masses album released in August of 98, but and then you guys have previously covered that, but I mean, like, it would have been nice if there was some of those other aspects that was involved instead of just a general who's who of alternative bands at the time,
right?
And that, but I mean, and we discussed that. I brought that up on the Discord lately. I mean, one of my favorite tracks off of that tribute album was Gus Gus with Monument. I mean, that project, they took a song from that wasn't a single off of, at the time, could have been most people's weakest album from the band, and made it their own. And when they did the 12-inch, one of the limited 12-inch for Only When I Lose Myself, I mean, their remix is phenomenal.
I was just gonna say, I mean, like, this makes me want to just go deep diving into all my favorite remixes, because the Gus Gus long mix of Only When I Lose Myself is top 5 for me.
Oh yeah. And so I mean, that's like, I mean, with other bands, I mean, for in the 90s, I mean, like, you're not going to have a band that has this. I mean, U2 and REM are probably the only two, and you guys have done those episodes, that you can say, yes, maintain that upper crust throughout the decade. Other bands have faltered, and that, whether it be through their own or through the public.
And I would even say U2's catalog, I mean, really since early 2000s has not been that strong. Not as
That's
strong
for
as
the
Depeche
Patreon
Mode.
bonus episodes in the 90s or in the 2000s.
Well, and I mean, I don't want to raise the ire of Ian, but I tapped out with Depeche Mode really like Exciter. I mean, I have not cared for much of anything in the last 20 years. But
Well, 2005 Playing the Angel is definitely the band's some girls moments, and that to use a music cliche. But I mean, but they all have their charms. I mean, like I could rank them, and that yes, the 2000s is obviously not as much up there compared to the 80s and 90s, but I mean, there's still stuff in there because I mean, I was going through the albums leading up to the release of Memento Mori last Friday, and it's just like it's like, you know what, yeah, I like this, this doesn't work, this does, and it's always hit or miss, and it's just like, okay, yeah, I mean, like, and some of it is as well as age. I mean, obviously, I mean, like after Exciter, I mean, all of us are now going to be in our late 20s, early 30s, so we're kind of past that music definition mode in our brains, and so that switch is firmly jammed on, and it's just like, you know what, sometimes it's like, yeah, it doesn't strike, but I mean, but then it's like you go back and listen to those albums, like, you know what, there are stuff there.
Jay, I'm gonna guess this is a survive the 90s rating for you.
For sure. I think what's super interesting is they're a band that the story I'm sort of hearing as I piece all this together and listen to everybody talk is that they created such a strong foundation in the 80s of like just continuing to work, put out a record, develop their sound, like just enduring that. By the time they got to the 90s, it just peaked musically and they exploded commercially. And if you've got those two things going for you, like as long as like everybody's healthy and you keep working, like it's really hard to screw that up at that point, even though a lot of bands do it. But and even now that it's basically down to 2 members, they're still putting out new music, touring, obviously selling out, having no issues. It's like a testament to putting in the hard work, which I don't know if it ever's going to happen again for a decade, and slowly building up a fan base and seeing it pay off.
It's difficult in any music environment now, just to get that support. And I mean, they lucked out with Daniel Miller. I mean, like, I mean, he's been a father figure to the band, and I mean, like, he helped nurture and develop them. And I mean, obviously, I mean, he produced their first 5 albums, but I mean, you don't get that nowadays. It's like, you know what, we want that hit single, we want that hit album, and if we don't see that, we're not signing you. And not like, you know what, I like what you're doing, let's work at this.
It's interesting too, like my perception of the band commercially is that they're still kind of alternative. Like they're not that overexposed to where like my wife was not going to know who Dave Gahan is. Like she will, if I showed her a picture of the band, she's not going to know it's Depeche Mode. If I played the songs, she would know.
Yes.
But like it's just like this really interesting, like they maintain a, like maybe even a little bit of mystique and like still have this alternative feel to them, even though they're commercially incredibly successful. It's very unusual.
That is an unusual
band,
line to walk.
Yeah, the band has always acknowledged that. I mean, they always feel like we're outsiders, and that like we're doing our thing. I mean, and again, I mean, like, even if you look at a lot of the alternative peers in the 80s going through, I mean, like, they didn't have 3 guys sitting behind keyboards with a reel-to-reel tape for the backing tracks and drums off to the side, or on stage in the case of the early days. I mean, like, there was always something else going on, and that. So I mean, even as they were coming up and developing, I mean, and going back, World Violation and Devotional, that didn't change. I mean, yes, Alan Water came out and played some drums on a half dozen songs, but I mean, it was still like 3 guys behind keyboards.
Right, which is not the norm for really the 90s or the 80s in terms
No.
of global success, in terms of album sales and touring and everything that's made, like you said it, Jay, like kind of this successful combination of cool and mystique. And I don't know, they just don't ever seem to have like lost the coolness. They've just always had that air about them,
Yeah.
which a lot of bands don't.
Yeah. In an era now where like everybody has to be on social media sharing every thought they ever had, I'm always drawn to bands that still have mystique and still value mystique. And there's, I think, something really important about, I hope we don't lose it, but like where you don't know everything about an artist. Like you hear stories here and there, but like mostly you know them through the music, not through, you know, celebrity gossip or like them posting every thought they've ever had on social media. It's kind of nice.
Yeah. Well, this was a deep dive on Depeche Mode in the 90s. Thank you both for taking part in this. Ian, this was a great pleasure. I'm glad we got to go into your brain and excavate so much information.
Oh yeah, and there's much more. I mean, like I said, I mean, this is a band. Like I said, it was my first album I bought myself. I mean, this is, and everything goes through them. I mean, this is a band that has definitely shaped me. I mean, musically. I mean, even personally. I mean, my wife jokes that I dance like Dave Gahan, and I'm like, not intentionally. So, but I guess there's maybe some subconscious element to it, just because it's like I said. I mean, this is definitely one that's band that has heavily influenced me on a lot of different aspects, and I mean, thanks to my wife. I mean, she definitely has a lot of patience and that for it. Like I said, I'm just a devoted fan, but she says no, it's obsessed, and that's so she's like, I don't know anyone who has the amount of material that you do on a single band in your basement.
Or she'd be surprised if she heard about Kiss fans.
Yeah, I was gonna say she needs to need to take her to a Kiss convention, and then she'll just
or Grateful
forgive
Dead,
you
or Grateful Dead.
Or Grateful Dead, exactly.
For sure.
Yeah.
But
she's not aware of how obsessive compulsive fans can be about buying merch for their favorite bands. That happens quite a bit. It has been a long evening. I know we all have to get up and go to work in the morning. So I'm going to say thank you to both Ian and Shiv for coming back on.
Anytime.
This was a lot of fun. And especially because I got to listen to a lot of Depeche Mode in the last week. So that was cool.
That's just a Tuesday for me.
That's just Tuesday Mode Day. I want to remind folks, if you want to suggest an album, you can go to digmeoutpodcast.com, suggest an album page. We're at Patreon, which you can join us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com is where those albums get suggested for our monthly tournaments. 27 albums enter, 1 album leaves, voted on by our patrons. It's also where you can read the box newsletter, sent out every week with new releases relevant to 80s, 90s, and now the aughts. Music, movies, TV, books. We cover it with new reviews every week. And finally, Apple Podcasts is where you go to leave some positive feedback about the show. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out. We'll be back next week with another episode. Dig Me Out.
It's only when I lose myself in someone else that I find myself. It's only when I lose myself in someone